Great. Okay. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Sawadika. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in Bangkok. I would have loved to visit. I visited Thailand many years ago now, but it was a lovely time, and I would love to come back sometime in the future. So a few words, I think you said most of it about me, but I'm Dr. Liv Lundberg. I'm based in Sweden. I have a PhD in energy and environment, and currently I'm a senior researcher at RISE. And I do research on BECCS and policies for carbon dioxide removals, negative emissions, but I've also worked as an advisor to the Swedish Energy Agency on their design of auctions for BECCS. But I will start with just a few words about Sweden, since that is a country far away from you in Thailand. Then we'll talk a little bit about Swedish policy for BECCS, what we have done in Sweden so far. And I will talk specifically about reversed auction, because that is our main policy tool in Sweden, and also something I have worked a lot on. Then I will also talk briefly about policy in other countries, and a little bit about the European Union and Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. Also a little bit about voluntary carbon markets and more long-term financing of BECCS. And then I will finalize with some key questions. So, yes, Sweden. So you are at the little star in Thailand and Bangkok, and I'm up in the green country there in Europe. And it's about a 6-hour time difference between us, so it's early in the morning for me. And a flight between Sweden and Bangkok would take about 12 to 13 hours. So we're really quite far apart geographically. And some of you might know quite a lot about Sweden, and maybe some of you have barely heard about us. But some Swedish things that you might have heard about. IKEA, I'm not sure if you have it in Thailand, but it's a big furniture store that you can find in a lot of places in the world, and it's Swedish. ABBA, at least when I was in Thailand many years ago, I heard ABBA music like Dancing Queen or Waterloo being played on the radio, which made me very happy then. We also have a royal family in Sweden, but they mainly are for ceremonial purposes. The real ones who make decisions are our Swedish government, which I have a picture of here with our Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson. We also have quite some companies such as Spotify, the music app, and there's also the Nobel Prize, that is a big scientific prize that they give out in Stockholm in Sweden. So our capital is Stockholm. It's on the east coast of Sweden, and in total we're about 10 million people in Sweden. So we're not a quite small country. Sweden is situated in Europe, and in Europe we have the European Union that Sweden is a member of. And in total there are 27 member states that you can see in color on this map. And in Sweden, we're still our own country, but EU, the European Union, does quite a lot of things together. So in European Union, we have joint climate targets, there are joint rules and regulations and policies. So that is a quite important context, that being part of the European Union impacts us a lot in what we can do and what we have to do, especially when it comes to environment and climate action. So Sweden, we are quite far to the north, as you've seen on all pictures. Sometimes it looks like a picture on the left. It's my own picture from, it's a bit further up north, and sometimes we have a lot of snow. And the picture on the right is how it can look like in the summer. And that picture is just quite close to where I live now. Right now it's winter, but also these things, since you see winter can be very cold here, we need a lot of heating for our houses, and we also need quite a lot of electricity, so that impacts our options for BECCS in Sweden. And another important context to BECCS is that Sweden is covered in forest to about 75%, so we have a lot of forest. And in the forest we have animals like these. This is something called elk or moose in English, älg in Swedish. And they are big as elephants. And you can see them sometimes. Some people come as tourists to Sweden just to see these moose. We don't have so many of them, so you don't see them wandering around but anywhere. But you can see them in zoos or, if you're lucky, in the woods. But we don't only use the forest is also used for a lot of other things than just as a home for the animals. So we have quite a lot of sawmills in Sweden that use wood from the forest. And we also have a big pulp and paper mill industry that uses pulpwood. And then we also use forest residues for heat and power plants. And we need quite a lot of them to heat places here. And the heat and power plants, they use residues from both sawmills, pulp and paper, and from forest harvesting. So we have a lot of bio-based industry in Sweden. And both heat and power plants and pulp and paper mills are good for doing BECCS on. So you put carbon capture and storage on these plants. So instead of emitting these biogenic emissions, you would store them and create carbon dioxide removals or negative emissions. I'm not sure what term you have used in other sessions or in Thailand, but I might talk about either carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions, and then I would mean basically the same thing, that you reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by capturing it from bio-based plants and then store it permanently. So here are a picture of different point sources of carbon dioxide emissions in Sweden. And the picture on the left are a bit smaller sources. They are between 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions up to 500,000 tons. And the picture to the right is big sources with over 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. And a lot of them are either heat and power plants or paper and pulp mills. In these figures, there's also even fossil emissions included, but a lot of it is biogenic. So the total biogenic emissions in Sweden is over 30 million tons per year. And we can compare this to our emissions, fossil fuel emissions, which mainly comes from electricity and heating, transport, industry, and then some from agriculture and waste management. And they are about a little bit over 50 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. So that was a little bit about background about Sweden, the context and the options that we have for BECCS. And so let's start talking about Swedish climate policy. And in 2017, the Climate Act was introduced, which is a law. And in that law, we set a target that by 2045, Sweden should have net zero emissions. And I think Sweden was one of the first countries in the world to do this, to have a net zero goal. And this goal, it also specifies that emissions, they have to be 85% lower than 1990. Yes, I saw someone raising their hands. Would you like to say something? Do you have a question? I don't hear any questions right now. Maybe I will go on and then we will also have time for
questions. Yes, we will have Q&A session after your presentation, so you can continue your presentation.
Yes, great. There will be time for questions as well then. So we have in this net zero climate target by 2045 that emissions have to be 85% lower than 1990. So the real fossil emission, they have to be reduced quite a lot. But then they also judge that the last 15% will probably be very hard to get rid of. And those are like emissions from the agriculture sector and some waste management. And they then said that those last 15%, it is okay to compensate for them by some kind of carbon dioxide removal, negative emissions. And this, if you calculate that in number, it corresponds to approximately 11 million tons of carbon dioxide removal that we would need in Sweden by 2045 to reach our net zero target. And also, in Sweden, they have also stated that the existing forest sink is not included in this. We cannot use, if, for example, we would have more forest growing in the trees growing in the forest, that would be a larger sink of emissions from Sweden. That could be some kind of negative emissions, but we are not allowed to use that. It's great if it happens, and we have some rules from EU that we have to increase our carbon sink in the forest, but we cannot use that to reach our net zero target. We have to also use things like BECCS. So I think this is also was an important factor why Sweden started to look at BECCS quite early. So basically, we are up here with emissions, and we need to go down there. So it's a lot of reductions until 2045. But then we have these last 11 million tons that we might not be able to reduce. And then we are allowed to use this compensation with negative emissions or carbon dioxide removals that are the same so that we reach net zero. Then the question became, like, they set this goal in 2017, and then the question was like, how could we achieve this? How could we get negative emissions in Sweden? And when Swedes and politicians and our decision makers, they don't know what to do, they like to do something that is starting a governmental inquiry, which is basically that you take a few smart, good people with knowledge in the area, and you give them a task of, you have to work with this for about a year or two. And then they write a long, long report, usually several hundred pages, where they go through the problem, all of the background, and then they come with suggestions, policy suggestions for how to solve this. And so then in 2020, or 2019 even, there was a government inquiry on how could we get this negative emissions by 2045. And they presented the results of this inquiry in 2020. And some things that they concluded in their report was that BECCS is likely a very central technology if we want to meet this net zero target by 2045. And with the total potential, I showed you this picture with different point sources earlier. And they calculated that how many point sources do we have, how much of biogenic emissions is there that we could do BECCS on. And then they found that the potential in Sweden could be around 30 million tons of BECCS per year, but that maybe around 10 million tons of those would be techno-economically feasible by 2045. Because some of those plants, they may be very small or very old and they are not suitable for BECCS, or it would be very costly to put BECCS on them. So we said the feasible potential could be 10 million tons by 2045. And most of the potential, as I mentioned earlier, for BECCS is in the district heating and power and paper and pulp industry. But then another question that we found in this inquiry was, how should BECCS be financed and incentivized? And I think maybe most of you, if you do work with BECCS, it's costly. You have to build a lot of extra equipment, you have to transport the carbon dioxide that you do capture, and then you transport it to some storage site and you have to store it there permanently. And of course, as an actor, maybe if you have a heat and power plant or a paper and pulp mill, doing all of that would be very costly for you, but you don't get any benefits from it. I mean, the one that benefits is the climate and all of us on the globe, because we are mitigating climate change. And I mean, Sweden, we get the benefits together because we reach our climate targets. But the single companies, they don't get any benefits from doing this. So this is, of course, a problem. And also, BECCS, to buy this equipment and set up the logistic chains to transport it to storage, it's large investments, and they also have long lifespans. So if you would dare to do such an investment, it would not maybe be enough to say, oh, but next year you will get this money to do this, but you don't know the year after that or the year after that. So it became clear that to do this, the companies who would do it would need long-term incentives and policies. So the government inquiry, they concluded that there was a lack of incentive in Sweden for BECCS. And their suggestion was that we should have a reverse auction as a policy to give subsidies to companies that would like to do BECCS. And that would be a short-term solution that we would start as soon as possible and maybe do until 2030, see how it goes. But then for the long run, we probably would need other ways to finance BECCS. And one option would be to include it in the European Emission Trading Scheme, which is called the EU ETS. Now we talk a little bit more about that in the end, very briefly. So that was the recommendations from this government inquiry. At the same time as this inquiry was ongoing, there is something called the Industry Leap program in Sweden. And this is a program where industries can apply for funding to take climate actions, to make their processes better or do other things that are good for climate mitigation. And in 2019, Swedish actors were allowed to apply for support for research, demonstrations, pilots, and investments in technologies that could lead to negative emissions by capturing, transporting, and storing greenhouse gases of biogenic origin. So you could get some money to start doing research and pilots on BECCS through this Industry Leap program. But you could not receive support for the total cost of a full-scale facility. And there was quite a lot of actors who applied for this funding. And there were projects of different types, both heat and power and paper and pulp. They were also in different parts of Sweden and of different sizes. And during the time period of 2019 to 2022, approximately $47 million were given for projects within the CCS value chain. And in 2020, they did a report on what have we learned from this Industry Leap program and from a BECCS project that were financed by it. So as I said, these are not full-scale, no full-scale plans, but they had like some small pilots, they did some pre-studies, and they concluded that conditions for carbon dioxide capture differ between different plants. But in general, if you want to have low cost of doing it, is generally advantageous to have, if you have large carbon dioxide volumes, so large plants. Also, if you have a high carbon dioxide concentration in the flue gases that comes out, then it's easier to capture carbon dioxide. And also, if you're many full load hours, you're running your plant a lot, it also becomes more economically efficient to do BECCS on the plant. But there are also some other factors that affect the cost and the practical feasibility and choice of technology. And another thing is number of chimneys. So your emissions comes out from the chimneys, and if you have like many chimneys, you might have many places where you need to capture the gases, which could be more costly. Also, just if you have available space if you want to build equipment to capture the gases, the emissions, and you might also need to have some storage close by where you can store things until it can be transported away to permanent storage. And I know some Swedish companies have problems with this, that they are in very tight spots. Maybe there are other industries close to them, or even houses, or they are close to like a river or something, and they can't really expand their area. And then it could be that they have a problem doing BECCS because they don't have a physical space. And also, of course, the state of the facility, is it new, old, etc. So this Industry Leap program, it went on, and it's still going on actually to some extent. And I think a lot of actors learned a lot, and also the government learned a lot, what it could mean to do BECCS in Sweden. And the actors started to get more ready for doing full-scale projects. But as I said, this industry was not enough funding for anyone to do a full-scale project, and you could not get funding for a full-scale project. So in 2020, the Swedish Energy Agency was tasked with investigating reversed auction for BECCS in Sweden to finance it. And in 2021, the Swedish government allocated about $3.6 billion for BECCS to be distributed through reverse auction between 2026 and 2046. So this budget is for the whole time period of 20 years. And later that same year, the Swedish Energy Agency presented a first report about how an auction could be done. And then it took 3 years. I started working with this around 2021, and I have worked with the Swedish Energy Agency since then. And it took 3 years, but then this last year, in August, the first auction for BECCS were finally open in Sweden. And then participants could submit their bids. And then in November 2024, the auction closed. So now we are waiting for results. They are still not public. So here you can just see a brief timeline of what has happened so far. We had the net zero target that kind of started all of this. Then we have a government inquiry identifying BECCS as a very important technology, and also realizing that we needed incentives and policies for BECCS. And then it took 4 years until 2024, when a first auction system was open and closed. Hopefully we will have winners announced this year, soon. And also in the auction, the rules was that if you were to participate in the auction, you needed to be able to promise that you would start operations by 2028. So hopefully we will have a first BECCS plant up and running by then in Sweden. So I talked a lot about reverse auctions, which is, as you have realized, a very central policy in Sweden. But how do they work? I also have this asterisk that auctions, they can also be known as tenders or procurement auctions. There are a lot of different names that kind of mean the same here. But maybe if you probably heard about the term auction, but then maybe it's more, maybe an art auction, that you have a painting and people are raising their hands and saying, I bid $100. And someone else says, no, I bid 150. And then someone 200. And nobody goes above that. And then you say sold to the highest bidder. The thing with reverse auction is that you do the opposite. That you submit bids, but the lowest bids win. This is what the reverse part means. And this is an example of what it could look like with a BECCS auction. So let's say that we have 4 actors here in Sweden, and all of them wants to build carbon capture and facilities on their plant and capture biogenic emissions and then store it to create negative emissions. And all of them, they have some different options and different costs. So actor A, they have calculated their cost to be about $140 per ton. Actor B, they have calculated their cost to be $99. C have a bit higher cost of $180, and D have cost of $115 per ton. And then the Swedish government, they open this auction and say, if you're interested in doing BECCS and can promise us that you will be able to do that, you can submit a bid for what you want to get paid per ton of biogenic CO2 that you will capture and store. And then all of these actors, they submit sealed bids. So basically with the Swedish government, they have a system online, and each company, they go in and they put their name and their volumes, and then we also said, okay, we want $140 per ton. And they don't see each other's bids, so it's secret. And then when the auction closes, all of them that wants to participate, they have had to submit their bids, and then the government opens the bids. And another important part is that these actors, they might have different sizes of their facilities. So actor A, they have 0.5 million tons, so 400,000 tons of BECCS per year. Actor B is even bigger with 0.5 million tons per year. Actor C is small with only 0.2 tons, and D have 0.7 million tons. And the thing that you do in an auction, the government does, is that you set the target for the auction, something you want to achieve. So in this case, this example, the government say, okay, we want 1.5 million tons of BECCS in total through this auction. And I might just only add that this is an example, hypothetical example. So this, the costs and also the number volumes, etc., are not real costs in Sweden, but they are in like reasonable range. But so the government, they have this quantity that they want to get. And what happens then, once all of the bids have come into the government, you make a list like this. You have company A, and you have their bid, and you have their volume. And then you sort this list. So now, the list is sorted with the lowest bid first. So then company B comes to the top of the list with their bid of $99 per ton. Then we have their volume, and to the far right here, we have, if we accept company B in the auction, we get 0.7 million tons of BECCS per year. If we also accept company D, we would get into the 1.4 million tons. If we also accept A, we would get 1.8, and then C, we would get into 2 million tons of BECCS. So we have this sorting, ranking of the bids, and what you do is that you start with the first bid, and if that bid is within your target, you say, okay, you are accepted, you are a winner in the auction. And then you go on to the next bid, the second lowest bid, and you see, are you within the parameters, the target of the auction? And then if that is true, okay, they are also a winner. So since we had this, we said that we have a target of reaching 1.5 million tons. We can see that, okay, if we get actor B, yes, that's good, that's within the target. Then actor D, yes, that's also within the target. So they are winners in the auction in this case. Then we have kind of reached our target. We are at 1.4 million tons per year. If we also would include actor A, we would get to 1.8 million tons per year. And maybe we don't have a budget to do that. Or it could be that the rule was we want to have at least 1.5 million tons. Then we would accept actor A as well. So this is basically how a reverse auction works. Actors submit bid for how much they want to get paid. And the lowest bids, you rank them, and then you take the lowest bid first and select winners until you have reached your target quantity. You could also, instead of having a target quantity, you could have a given budget. And then you have to calculate, okay, how much budget would each actor cost? And when you accept them, all still in the ranking order, but until you have exhausted your budget. So there are some good things with auctions. So with auctions, the government can control the budget. You can say, we have this budget, and then you use that budget in the auction. And once the budget is finished, the auction is also over. And another thing, usually, another option to auctions might be that, okay, you say, the government say, if you do BECCS, you will get $100 per ton from us as well. But it might be hard for the government to know how much money do the companies need, what are their costs. In an auction, the actors, they get to bid their own costs, their estimate, how much money do I need per ton to do this? And then they submit that as a bid to the auction. And since the lowest ones win in the auction, actors are incentivized to submit low bids. And this is to still be so that it matches with your cost. And also, a final thing could be, what should the actors get paid? So we said that, I showed you that actor B and D would be winners in the auction. And the auction type that we have in Sweden, it's called a pay as bid, or a discriminatory auction, in auction terminology. And what happens then, when actor B and D win, actor B, they asked for $99 per ton. And that is also then what they get a contract for and get paid. And D, they asked for $115 per ton. So they get a contract for that and are paid that. So using a reverse auction is also a way that you can differentiate payments. So each actor gets paid what they need to do BECCS, and you don't overpay some actors too much. So this both that you actors are incentivized to submit low bids, and also that you can differentiate payments. It can make a reverse auction quite cost efficient. So they have auctions like this. They have been used also for giving support to wind power, solar power. It has been quite popular in many, at least European countries, but I think also globally. And the European Union that we are part of generally, they like auctions. And to do this auction, we had to ask them for permission. And then they were happy that it was an auction system. So a little bit more specifically about the auction. Now I explain how does reverse auction work in general. But what was the more specific rules in Sweden. So to take part in the auction, you had to be a BECCS actor in Sweden. It was not allowed for companies in other countries to take part of this. And if you would win in the auction, you get a contract for 15 years. So during 15 years, for each ton of biogenic carbon that you capture from your plant and then transport it away and store it, and you can prove that to the government, then the government will pay you as you bid for that ton. And they will do that for your whole volume, or the volume you put into the auction, and for 15 years. So it's a quite good deal, I would say, for the actors. And they can apply for subsidies to cover their total cost of doing BECCS. And this includes transport, capture, storage, etc. But then we have this rule that participants had to start operations within 3 years, so no later than 2028. And I would say, even though we don't know the winners and we don't have an evaluation yet of the auction, I would say that this was a very tough requirement. There was actors that I thought would enter the auction. They have talked a lot about being ready to do BECCS, but they didn't. And we think that one reason could be this very tight deadline for having to start operations. So this might be something that could be good for you to a lesson. But also we had this total budget of $3.6 billion that the government allotted. But it was also said that this is a large sum of money. So if the price per ton would be around $120, this would be sufficient to cover around 2 million tons of BECCS per year for 15 years. But it might be that costs could be higher. I will talk more about that shortly. And also, the first auction, it didn't have to use this whole budget. There were some other requirements. So it could also be that we will have more auctions with this budget. So then who could apply for this? I already mentioned that it had to be actors that are in Sweden. The plants had to be in Sweden. And it was only existing companies with carbonized emission from biogenic sources, such as it could be heat and power plants, as I mentioned, it could also be pulp and paper plants, and also some biofuel producers would fulfill this criteria. And it was not allowed, you could not have new facilities that you would come in with the purpose of burning biomass to create carbon dioxide removals. So if you would build a plant just to do BECCS, that was not allowed in the auction. You would be disqualified directly. And that is because people were afraid that if it gets too profitable to do this, and especially with the government support, that people would just like build plants and just burn biomass for the sake of it to get this money. And I mean, of course, biomass is good for other things as well, and we don't want to cut down all the forests. So this was one of the things that it was important that only existing power plants that already have these operations where they use biomass could take part, and then you would add BECCS on that. So the cost, as they can include all cost, and this include investment cost for buying equipment for carbon dioxide capture, running cost to capture the carbon. It could be for extra heat, electricity, labor costs, everything. And investment costs, you could also include interest rates and those. And also you might need short-term storage by your facility. That could be included. And then also transport and the cost of long-term storage. And then a little bit about storage. So Sweden, we don't have any good storage site ourselves in Sweden. And there's actually some kind of law that prohibits storage of carbon dioxide in the ground in Sweden. But we have some geological formation, as you can see on this map. The pink and green circles are potential storage sites in Europe. So we have some in Sweden, but we are not allowed to use them right now due to current law, but that law is being looked at. It might be changed in the future. But we have neighboring countries. We have up here, we have Norway to the left of us, and we have Denmark below us. And both of them have storage sites. And they also, both Denmark and Norway have experience with working with like oil and gas fields. So they have kind of the knowledge and experience of how to do this, inject carbon dioxide into geological formations. In Sweden, we're not an oil nation. We have no oil or gas. So we don't really have the techniques or equipments or people to do this. So it's something we would have to learn if we would start doing it. This area is pointing to Norway and Denmark, so you can see them. And Norway, we have come quite far. We have something called Northern Light Storage. And here's just a picture of how that looks, that you capture the carbon, you transport it, they have some receiving terminal, and then they have a permanent storage, which is saline aquifers, which is, here is the sea, and then it's 2,600 meters below the seabed, so it's far down. So the Swedish actors, I mean, the ones who will participate in the auction are the plants, power plants, heat and power, or pulp and mill paper. So, but then they are responsible for the whole value chain, but they will probably not, but they can't do the storage themselves. So they have to get that service from some other acts. So they buy that as a service. So they come to, for example, to Northern Light and say, okay, we want to store our carbon. Can you give us a deal on that? And then they pay Northern Lights per ton of carbon that they give them. And the transport is a bit, sometimes it can be the Swedish actors who does it, and sometimes it could be like Northern Light has a package that they also do the transport for you. So when you get to your bid, they basically, you take all of what are the total cost of doing all of this, and you divide it, what are the volume of BECCS in total, and then you get the bid in dollar per ton of BECCS. So a little bit about cost approximations. Before we had any real facts about this, I think the cost estimates from the literature were usually that BECCS could be done for, some of them were even for under $100 per ton. In 2021, me and a colleague, we did interview studies with Swedish actors, and a lot of them had been part of this industry leap. So they had done some pre-studies. And then the estimates that they gave us was between $100 and $200 per ton. So already then we saw like, okay, this might be more expensive when what it seemed like from the literature. We also saw that they were like large facilities with large volume were usually good for having lower cost. And also if you were close to harbor, because then it's easier with the transport. But then while I have been working with this, it started to come estimates from the industry. This was, I don't have any literature or papers on this, but they were more things that they said in conversations or at events. And then we started to talk about costs about rather around $200 per ton. And last year, they even came cost estimate that it might be even $300 per ton to do this in Sweden. So the cost estimates have increased a lot over the last 3 years. And so why are the cost estimates increasing in Sweden? I think there are some potential explanations. One is that the electricity prices in Sweden have gone up quite a lot. And a lot of these, to do the BECCS, you might need quite a lot of electricity, at least for some of the technologies. So that makes it more expensive. There's also been quite a high inflation with interest rates going up. And this has been in all of Europe and also other parts of the world. And especially in Europe, it's related to the war in Ukraine. Then also there has been reports of higher costs of transport and storage. Could also be to do with fuel prices, but also there are very few storage sites that are ready already now. So it could be that they are increasing their costs because they are in such high demand. So there are some potentially real reasons, but it could also be that the actors actually are getting better knowledge of the real cost. I mean, the literature studies were very hypothetical. And then the interview studies, most of the actors, they had maybe done a pilot or some very small scale experiments, but now they are getting closer to having plans to actually do this for real in large facilities. So it could be that BECCS are more expensive than what we thought, or it could be the other factors. It could even be that because all of these actors, they know, of course, of the auction and that the Swedish government are going to decide how much money they get and what their bids, etc. So it could be that they also want to get higher profits and revenues by kind of inflating their costs and making it look more expensive. We don't know that. So how could these projects be financed in Sweden? So they have to add up all of the costs that they need coverage for and then they could submit a bid that covers all of its cost. That is allowed. And also in the auction, they had to, when they submitted their bid, they also had to show the Swedish Energy Agency their calculations of like, why do I need this much money as I put in the bid? But they could also do like this. They could have a bid in the auction. They could also get other subsidies, for example, from the European Union, and they could sell carbon credits from the BECCS volume that they produce. So this other revenues from voluntary carbon markets, when I started working with this and when we started working with auction, it felt very uncertain with carbon markets. And most actors said that no, there are no markets, we can't get paid, we need the government support. But I would say that have changed quite a lot in the last few years. One of the big actors here are Microsoft. They are committed to being carbon negative by 2030, and they will reduce their greenhouse gases, but they will also use removals from that to compensate for the rest. And some of the Swedish actors, they have entered big deals with companies such as Microsoft. So we have one company in Sweden, BECCS company, which is called Stockholm Exergi, and they announced a huge deal with Microsoft. And they also had a huge deal with a foundation called Frontiers. So there seems to be quite some interest, and especially for some of the big projects. And of course, if you sell carbon credits, you might not need as much money from the government. So then you can have a lower bid. And as we learned earlier, if you have a lower bid, you have a higher chance of winning in the auction because you get a better ranking. So, a little bit briefly about what happened in the auction. So there was 6 bids that came in, but only 4 of them were actual BECCS actors. And I will talk a little bit about each of them. So one of them is this Stockholm Exergi that I mentioned when it comes to carbon credits. And they have a huge heat and power plant called Värtaverket in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and it's fueled by biomass. And they have a capacity of 800,000 tons of BECCS per year, so they are a big facility. And they have been doing research on this since 2019 and even earlier. They have decided their technology that they're going for is hot potassium carbonate, HPC process. It uses a lot of electricity, but they have decided that this would be the best. And they have a planned starting date at 2028. And they also gotten money from the European Union, and they have gone out with a lot of press releases that they have sold credits on voluntary carbon markets. This is the biggest player in Sweden. They are very professional. They have worked with this in a long time, and they are really ready to do this for real. Then we also have Öresundskraft. They are in southern part of Sweden. They are in a waste incineration plant. So they have both biogenic and fossil emissions. And in the Swedish support system with auction, they can get support for the biogenic part, but they will not get any money from the CO2 emissions that come from fossil regions. And they are also heat and power plants. And they hope to start operations already in 2027. And they have also gone out with press releases that they have sold carbon credits on voluntary carbon market to help finance the project. Then we have Skellefteåkraft. They are in the northern part of Sweden. Actually, they are a bit newer, and they are not as, I don't know so much about them, to be honest. It's also a heat and power plant. And they're definitely smaller than Stockholm Exergi, maybe rather in the site of Öresundskraft. And then we had Preem, which is, they stand out a bit because they are a refinery, making both fossil fuels like diesel and benzene, but also biofuels. And they plan to have CCS on their operations to achieve 500 ton of emission reductions. And they say that they will have a full-scale operations late 2020, so probably that means around 2020. Who decided to go into the auction. And as you see, so one challenge with the auction is that could be that one in the north wins and maybe also one in the south. And there's really, and then they have to transport by themselves or through some intermediary the carbon dioxide to storage in Norway and Denmark. And there's not really any incentive to coordinate this transport in the Swedish system as it is now, which I would say is a drawback. And there's no like plans for building pipelines by the Swedish government and such things. So that is a negative thing with auctions, that they don't incentivize collaborations on like infrastructure. And there might be a lot of infrastructure dependencies, but would be more cheap if you did things together. It could also be expensive to take part in the auction for the actors. There's quite a lot of work going into calculating a bid and so. And as you see, we didn't have so many participants in Sweden, and this also makes it less competitive. And they might feel like, oh, but I can probably win anyway, so I might not need to put a low bid. Then they can do some strategic bidding and maybe put a bit higher bids so they can have some profit. And of course, it could be good with some profit, but we don't want them to have too much profit because it is government money. And also in the auction, I mean, only a few or even just one actor will win. And all of the other ones, they are ready to do this, but if they don't get support, they probably will not be able to build their plant. So there are also some controversies around the auction in Sweden, I would say. One is that only BECCS is supporting through it. And as I mentioned, there was 6 bids, but only 4 were BECCS, and 2 were actually protest bids. They were not BECCS actors, they could not do BECCS in any way, but they had other ways to do carbon dioxide removals. Some were like agriculture companies that said, okay, we can create negative emissions in this way. Why are you only giving money to BECCS? So that is one thing that might be worth discussing. Should the support system only support BECCS? And in Sweden, we decided that yes, we want to do it that way, but it can also be questioned by, especially by some actors. And also, BECCS actors, as I mentioned, they can sell carbon credits. And in some ways, it's good because then they can have a lower bid in the auction and the government has to pay less. And you can have this joint financing. But also at the same time, all of these BECCS facilities that are built in Sweden, the carbon dioxide removal from them, that will go into the Swedish inventory of emissions as negative emissions. And you see this blip here. But they can also at the same time sell the same volumes to to other companies that can then use them to say that, oh, we're carbon neutral because we bought negative emissions from this company in Sweden. So the emissions are kind of used both to reach Swedish target, but could also then be used by companies in their promotion. But it could not be used, like, for example, if an American company buys credits from Swedish BECCS, they can use it as in the company inventory and in their marketing of their products, but they could not like take that and then say in the US that like, our emissions in the US are lower because we have these credits. That is not allowed. So two countries cannot use the same negative emissions, but it could be like a country like Sweden and a company could use it. And this has been, companies think that this is okay, and also the Swedish government is okay with this at this point. But it has been questioned, especially by environmental NGOs and also by researchers. So it might also be good that this could be a solution to have this, but it could also be questioned. And so what happens next in Sweden? Hopefully we will have an announcement of the winners soon. I will actually talk to the Swedish Energy Agency later today, so I'll see what they say then. Potentially there will be more auctions between 2025 and 2030. But this, with the budget that we have currently of $3.6 billion, in the best case scenario, I would say we could maybe get around 2 million tons of BECCS financed through that. And at the same time, our net zero target to reach that in 2045, we would need around 11 million tons. So that is quite a big gap, even though we have this support system. So somehow we need to bridge that. But then you can also briefly talk about other countries. Denmark, our neighbor in Europe, they have also have auctions. They actually started working on them later in Sweden, but they managed to open and close their first auction before us. So the Swedish company has been a bit mad about this and asked, why can't you do as Denmark and be fast? And but they have had at least 1, 2, even 3 auctions. In the first auction, it was not only for BECCS, it was also general CCS. But the BECCS company won, Ørsted. They also had a deal with Microsoft to sell carbon credits, which might be good to know. Then they have a second auction. United Kingdom, England, they have taken quite a different approach. And I think it's interesting. I mentioned this with infrastructure, that auction doesn't incentivize that, like pipelines and joint infrastructure. But in England, they have instead decided to focus on clusters, industrial clusters. And there you have like geographical locations where you have a lot of emissions, and they go together to the government and say, we are a cluster, we want support to do CCS in our cluster. And it can be both fossil CCS and biogenic BECCS. So the government there have already selected some clusters and they will support, and then this cluster and the government together can build infrastructure such as pipelines to transport the CO2. So this will be interesting to see what will happen with. The US, they have, I would say that they are more focused on DAX, at least when I last looked at them. But they have this tax credit that you could get, especially for DAX, and then you could tax credit up to $180 per ton. There have also been some carbon dioxide removal pilot purchasing program. I think there's quite a lot going on there, but now also with the new president, we don't know what will happen with this. Also in the European Union, a lot is happening with carbon dioxide removals. There is a certification framework, the CRCF, that has been established, and that is basically just to be able to say, what is carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions? What requirements do you have to fulfill to be counted as this? So it's about measuring and validating these emissions. And it's not only BECCS, it's also other types of removals. And then there's also an industry plan, including carbon management, which would include CCS. And I would say this is an important directive in Europe. It's called the Empowering Consumer for the Green Transition. And in it, it says that companies, they can't claim that their products are like net zero emissions if they have bought compensation for example, through carbon credits. For companies to say, oh, my product is carbon neutral, they actually have to have no emissions, or they have to compensate within their own value chain. So this could have, it's newly decided in this directive, but it could have an impact on carbon markets. And this is in Europe, then if you sell goods or products in Europe, you have to do this. And also very briefly, I just want to mention the Paris Agreement Article 6, because that one is about how states and countries can cooperate and transfer mitigation outcomes between each other, and also through markets. And I know this is still being developed, and I'm not an expert on this, but potentially if countries would like to trade negative emissions with each other, it probably would happen under this Article 6. I know that Sweden has a pilot program with Switzerland in Europe as well, about actually just doing this for a small sum, just to see how it works with the laws, etc. And so in the long run, especially, for example, if Thailand has a big potential for BECCS and wants to sell some kind of credits for that to other countries, it might be done through Article 6 in the future. Then I mentioned, like in Sweden, maybe we'll have 2 million tons through our current auction program. What to do in the long run? Who should pay for BECCS in the long run? Should it be national governments through a support scheme? Should it be companies on voluntary carbon markets? Should it be those who are still emitting when we need the negative emissions? But that could be like agriculture, which might not have the money to pay. So should it be current emitters? There has been some suggestions that you should tax or have some payment for current emitters, and then you could use it later. Or should it be some kind of mandatory quotas for companies or consumers? And the European Emission Trading Scheme is such an example. So here are some Swedish actors. They have show like, okay, how could finance happen in different timelines? It could be that like in the short run, we might need state support, but in the future, maybe there will be more quotas, mandatory quotas on transport or waste or agriculture, or voluntary carbon markets could be at the same time. And maybe we also would have some EU policies, such as the European trading system. So it's just like a potential, how could it evolve over time? Mainly focus on the European situation and Swedish situation. So one thing, countries doing this, I mean, it's a good starting point, but probably it will get too expensive in the long run. So you would need something else. When I speak to policymakers in different countries, many of them are a bit skeptical towards also voluntary carbon markets, at least to do it on the long run and large scale for BECCS. Since they are voluntary, it's a bit like, can you really trust that they will be there for 15, 20, 25, 30 years? But they could still be very important now in the beginning, as we see in Sweden as well. And in Europe, many countries look to the European Union to finance BECCS together in some way. So, some final key takeaways from Sweden. We had this industry leap with funding for research pilot and demo plans, and that has been really great to build knowledge and make actors ready, but it has not been enough to incentivize commercial BECCS large scale. And when you speak to Swedish actors, they say that to do BECCS, we'll need long-term incentives, 10 to 20 years, some kind of secure contracts or policies. And cost estimation for BECCS in Sweden, they have increased from under $100 to over $200, maybe even $300 between 2021 and today. There are some explaining factors, but one could be that they know their costs better, but it could also be contextual factors. And also, it is possible to combine government funding and voluntary carbon markets, but it can also be controversial. And then we have the voluntary carbon markets. There is a rapidly increasing interest, but the rules, at least in Sweden and Europe, is a bit unclear. So we're not really sure what role they will play. And in the long run, Article 6 under the Paris Agreement could also become important for international trade with carbon credits. And that was my whole presentation. Thank you so much, Kakunka.